in fact, a very unique species, but I won't get into that. So, I started thinking about why am I in this Greenpeace thing here? I'm the only one with any science among the political activists. And then they decided to have a campaign to ban chlorine worldwide. I'm going, you guys, it's one of the elements in the periodic table. Not only that, adding it to drinking water was the most important advance in the history of public health. And about 80% of all our synthetic pharmaceuticals, that would be medicine, is made from chlorine chemistry. The reason chlorine is so important for public health and medicine is precisely because it's toxic to bacteria that are trying to kill us. So there you go. I had to leave, and I'm glad I did. I left peaceably. There was no big fight or anything. I just decided to go and do something else. I haven't got time to tell you all about that, but here's where I begin with this presentation. The very fundamental of science is observation. With the eyes, with microscopes, with telescopes, with radiation detectors, with technology of many kinds, we can observe natural phenomena. And during those observations, we often notice that one thing comes after another. That'd be the cause and effect principle. So that's what we're looking for, is we're trying to observe what causes what, and not get it backwards, like some people do. So observation is the basis of science. Here's an observation that's been made. This is over, I'm sorry if you can't read the print in the back, but you can see the lines, and I can show you that the temperature of the Earth, going back 570 million years, and the CO2 levels in the atmosphere of the Earth are almost always out of sync. Here in particular, temperature goes down while CO2 is coming up, temperature goes back up while CO2 is going down. This does not indicate a causal relationship. Correlation is necessary for causation. If two things aren't correlated, they're obviously not cause and effect. But many times, correlations do not indicate causation. The second main principle of science is called replication. Doing it over and over again to see if you get the same result. Anytime a scientist publishes a paper saying, I did this, and here was my methodology, the methodology is a very important part too. That's where you try to make sure that other influences aren't coming in from the outside and you're just looking at the things you're studying. But if they can't repeat it, it brings into question whether or not it is actually a truth, a true cause-effect relationship. So observation and replication, really, that's it. It's so simple. That is the basis of scientific discovery. There's replication. Now here is a very strong correlation. The correlation between ice cream sales and shark attacks. It is one of the stronger you will find. This does not necessarily prove causation, because obviously ice cream sales do not cause shark attacks, or vice versa. But they are actually both caused by a common third factor, which is the summer. Warm temperatures cause people to go swimming after they've had an ice cream and get attacked by a shark. In the winter, that seldom happens. So do not base your judgment on what is cause and effect simply by a correlation, because you'll look for the third underlying factor, or even more factors. So the thesis of my presentation today, given that observation is the way we can prove things to ourselves, is that by far the majority of today's invented catastrophes and threats of doom are about things that are invisible or extremely remote, like where you can't go and see them for yourself because they're so far away, or a combination of the two. This means that you have to rely, the general public, has to rely on activists, media, politicians, and other experts to tell them the truth about what's really going on with, for example, carbon dioxide. It's pretty hard to look over the other side of the room there and look at the damn carbon dioxide's doing over there. Right? Because you can't see it. It's invisible. So invisible things and remote things are easy to make up stories about and sensation about. Number one, I'm not going to go through all 14, or 12. You'll see that I get quick at the end here, but I'm going to do the first important ones. Polar bears will become extinct due to global warming and ice loss. That is a major campaign that's been going on for years because the Arctic is warming and the ice is getting thinner and blah, blah, blah. How many people can go to the Arctic and count the polar bears? Because they're not invisible. But nobody's going to go up there. So every year, a whole bunch of scientists on serial government grants go up there for a few weeks and come back and tell us all the polar bears are going extinct and I want to go there again next year, so give me some more money. That's what's been going on for years. And they come back every time and say the polar bears are going extinct. This is the picture in National Geographic that they said was the face of climate change. This is a poor dying old bear, is what it is. It's got nothing to do with climate change. Bears get old just like we do, only there's no old folks' homes for them. And that's what that is there. He's probably got no teeth left, and he's too weak to hunt. So they show that as the face of climate change. Another picture of the same bear. This went worldwide. Everywhere. This is climate change. Before 1973, polar bear hunting was unrestricted. There were no rules from any country in the circumpolar region of the Arctic to control polar bear hunting. In 1973, a treaty was signed to control unrestricted hunting. Some countries forbid polar bear hunting. Other countries like Canada allowed 2% of the population to be taken, requiring an Inuit guide who got a good chunk of money from some kind of American trophy hunter. Today, the polar population is estimated between 22 and 31,000. Actually, Susan Crockford, who is my friend in Victoria, who's now finally got some attention for her work on this, estimates that there may be as many as 40,000. It's not as if there's a lack of ice in the Arctic. This is just last year. The Arctic is not melting, even though they tell you that every day. The Arctic is another place that's remote, that almost no one can go and see on a daily basis and figure it out for themselves. But when the ice does shrink, it opens up the ocean, which then the sun can shine on and promote the growth of plankton, which promotes the growth of fish, which promotes the growth of seals, which promotes the growth of polar bears. There is a food chain hypothesis that's exact opposite to the idea if there's less ice, there'll be less polar bears. I believe in that one myself. Because if the whole Arctic is covered in ice, how's anything going to grow there? Not much grows under ice. It's only when the ice melts away, now the sun can come down and promote growth of marine stuff. This is what just happened last November. Nunavut, which you know is the Inuit zone of the Arctic, the treeless zone of the Arctic where the polar bears happen to be. They've been there for 2,000 to 3,000 years at least. They live there all year round, many of them. They still live in what are basically subsistence societies up in the north of Baffin Island. I mean, Iqaluit, which is the capital up there, that's more like a government place where they have lots of light plants burning lots of oil for everybody. But up north, people live like killing seals still for a living and for eating. And they say there's too many polar bears now. They put in a study to the Nunavut government saying there's too many polar bears. They're eating our people. They're breaking into our houses. The unrestricted hunting policy has had the effect of a growth in the population to triple, quadruple, even 5 times what it was. Now, I don't know what you do when there's too many polar bears, but I bet the Inuit have some idea about what you do. It's all about a balance in nature, and we're being told they're going extinct. 2, climate catastrophe is inevitable unless we end the use of fossil fuels and stop CO2 emissions. Well, CO2, as I mentioned, is the most invisible thing there is that's causing the most number of horrible things to happen in the world. It's being blamed for everything, including the polar bears, of course, because they say it's global warming that is hurting the polar bears, when in fact it looks to be benefiting them. So, back again to this graph, which now has this green arrow in it, which indicates the direction in which global CO2 in the atmosphere has gone for the last 500 million years, down. The reason for this dip here, this is called the Carboniferous. This is when trees were invented by evolution. Before that, there were no trees. Trees today are 90% of vegetation biomass on the Earth. They're basically 90% of all living matter on the Earth. If you look at a mountainside and think, how much do the trees weigh compared to all the animals living in there and all the insects living in there? And the trees are 50% carbon from CO2 in the atmosphere. So they drew down the carbon there. We don't know why it went down so far. I have a paper that talks about it, but it's too much for now. But anyways, it came back up again to here, about 2,500 parts per million, which is about 5 times higher than it is today. And from there on, it just continued to decline. Why did it decline? While temperature went up, it was declining. This is 100 million years, this is 50 million years, this is a log scale, so the closer you come to this end, the shorter time period is shown there. Carbon dioxide has declined in the global environment because of calcifying marine organisms, which turn CO2 in the ocean and calcium in the ocean into calcium carbonate to make shells for themselves. It's like a knight in armor. Clams, corals, all the phytoplankton, many of them learn to make shells for their soft bodies to be protected from predators. And those shells sink to the bottom and form all the limestone deposits in the world, and the chalk and the marble, which is all the same chemical. Carbonaceous rock, calcium carbonate, has sucked the CO2 out of the air over the millennia. Inadvertently, life, by evolving the ability to calcify and make these armor platings for themselves in the sea, presaged the death of life by bringing CO2 down to levels here that were almost at the level of the death of plants. And this is an hour-long lecture if I was going to tell you the whole story, we have put some of that CO2 back into the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels, which were made by trees and plants and plankton in the first place, that drew CO2 out of the atmosphere and got it buried in the ground. And cement, which is made from calcium carbonate, limestone. It's about 10% of our annual CO2 emissions. Fossil fuels are about 90. By putting the CO2 back into the atmosphere from where it came, we humans inadvertently restored a balance to the global carbon cycle after it was going down steady for 150 million years because of loss to the sediments from the calcifying marine organisms. Excuse me. The other, I don't know what I can do about that. I can look here instead of looking back there. The other falsehood of the climate catastrophe narrative is that all weather events are getting worse and more extreme. These four graphs show in order hurricanes globally, losses from disaster by GDP, average drought conditions in the contiguous US 48 states going back to 1890, annual count of strong violent tornadoes. Today, with the tornadoes that are happening in the US, they're all going on Twitter about how these are the worst hurricanes there's ever been in human history or in the whole world history or whatever. No, actually there's been a decline in tornadoes in the United States. These are real figures, no question about it. And even the IPCC, which is pretty hardcore on the climate crisis issue, makes it clear that we do not know of any trends, excuse me, in extreme weather events because of any reason. While there is no scientific proof that CO2 is causing the recent warming, which is about 1 degree Celsius, thank you very much. I am just ending a cold, and of course the cough comes last. It is absolutely certain that increased CO2 is greening the earth. Carbon dioxide is the main food for plants. It is the basis of all life. Plants need at least 150 ppm. It had got down to 180 in the last glaciation, 18,000 years ago. It's now, we brought it back up to 415. That's what I mean by restoring the balance of the carbon cycle. This is NASA saying this, not some hippy-dippy group. And all over the world, they know this is true, that not only does increased CO2 result in increased productivity of trees and food crops, but it also makes plants more efficient with water, so that plants can spread out into areas, into drier areas where they couldn't live before. Excuse me. Every greenhouse grower in the world, commercial greenhouse growers, pump CO2 into their greenhouses to get 2 to 3 times the atmospheric level in the world today, because that's where it was in the past. That's what plants evolved to, was to want 800 to 1200 to 2000 ppm. You can go all the way up to 3000 and they still keep growing faster. All this work is in the literature. They do that to get 20 to 60% increase in growth, because greenhouses is an economically intensive business. Costs more than just doing it in an open field. So they found here they can be very profitable as long as they pump CO2 into their greenhouse. Here's the relationship between life expectancy and CO2 emissions by humans. Of course, CO2 emissions is a proxy for fossil fuel consumption, which has given us longevity, wealth, and personal freedom. Those 3 things are good. There's absolutely no question that fossil fuels, which of course should be used effectively and with as much conservation as we can, with better fuel standards and everything, but you can only do so much. You can only squeeze so much out of a lemon. But this matters a lot more than the fake CO2 climate crisis. Just compare the two. Longevity and health, wealth, and personal freedom. The freedom to go south for a holiday in the winter, for example. Number 3, coral reefs around the world are dying. Coral reefs are largely invisible and remote. Here's 2016, April. The whole world was told that 93% of the Great Barrier Reef is dead, dying, or gonna die. 93%. You know what the real figure was? 93% of the reefs in the northern section, north, middle, and southern, 93% of the reefs in the northern section had some bleaching. Say there's 200 reefs in the northern section. So it could have been 1% of each reef, or 5%. That got translated into 93% of the Great Barrier Reef. I'll try and go faster. The Great Barrier, this is the next year, 2017. The Great Barrier Reef is now terminal. Great Barrier Reef at terminal stage. Forbes, Great Barrier Reef in its final terminal stage. It's sort of like watching the mainstream news where every single station from MSNBC to NBC to CBS to every one of them all uses the same term within an hour of each other, like someone's feeding it to them. I think they are getting fed. So there you go. This is 2018. Great Barrier Reef definitely not dead. Great Barrier Reef showing signs of recovery. Coral Reef show remarkable ability to recover from near death 2 years later. Very few media carried this though. Coral bleaching is not death. It is a natural event from which coral normally recovers fully. Shouldn't scientists and eco-reporters know that? They do know it. I don't know if you've heard of Peter Ridd from Queensland, who was fired from his university for opposing the Great Barrier Reef is dying narrative. He just won his case, but they're going to appeal it. They're going to try to get rid of him. They don't care that the judge found them so totally guilty of being against free speech and all the rest. But I gave them some money. The stupidest thing about this idea that the coral reefs are going to go extinct with global warming is that the area of the ocean which is warmest, which is the Coral Triangle, here, Indonesia, the Philippines, Solomon Islands, in this area, you can see that's the darkest red. It's a shallow sea that's surrounded by the archipelago of Indonesia. That is where the highest biodiversity of corals in the world exists, and the highest biodiversity of reef fish exists. I've been on 2 week-long expeditions on little boats in there, snorkeling through this amazing wonderland. And if you want a bucket list and you don't be scared of the ocean and like to go snorkeling, go there. This is the truth. So what, in fact, this Pleistocene Ice Age we're in now, the coral reefs have shrunk to a far greater extent, lesser extent than they were during the warm periods of the Earth's history, which was most of the Earth's history. This is the Pleistocene Ice Age. We're just in an interglacial period. Excuse me. This is when coral reefs evolved, when CO2 was about 6,000 parts per million, 15 times its present level. They were living back there. It's got nothing to do with the temperature. Look, an ice age happened here when CO2 was up around 10, 15 times higher than it is now. Another one happened here, and CO2 went down with it. So they say, oh, this must be the cause. But look, then temperature went back up to here while CO2 stayed low. There is no causal relationship in global history between CO2 and temperature. 4, there is a sea of plastic garbage twice the size of Texas in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Right? That's remote, isn't it? I'll show you in a minute, it's also invisible. This is the kind of thing you find on the internet. This Photoshop stuff. These are the seas of garbage. All the way from Japan to the United States. It's twice the size of Texas. Here's another one. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch. See it there? Looks pretty real, doesn't it? Here it is again. It's damn near as big as South America. Here's a real satellite photograph of the Pacific Ocean. There's the Hawaiian Islands. There's Fiji, New Zealand, and the other islands. See a giant garbage patch anywhere? It's total BS, total lie. Does not exist, never did. There's nothing even close to it out there. Now, it's not as if there isn't any plastic in the ocean, but this plastic ocean is because of the Japanese tsunami that killed 16,000 people and wiped off the whole landscape into the sea. That's where they got that picture from. And then they call it plastic ocean. This is a real picture, right? They cut open the bird and look what was inside it. Oh my God. There's all this fake stuff on the internet. They faked that. They put that stuff there. It's true that birds have some plastic in them. You know why? Because the mothers feed it to them. Now, why would a mother feed plastic to its bird? They got David Attenborough practically weeping out there with an albatross feeding its chick some piece of plastic, right? He says, oh, it's mistaking the plastic for food. It's terrible. No, it's giving the chick the piece of plastic because it's hard and will go into its gizzard and help grind up the food. Because there's no teeth on birds. That's why they have a second stomach called a gizzard. Anybody who farms knows that. They have a normal stomach too with acid in it, like ours. But they have another one. That's why all birds eat pebbles, to grind up the food in their gizzard. But there's not many pebbles in the ocean. So seabirds traditionally use pumice from undersea volcanoes that comes to the surface and floats. They look for little pieces of pumice and give it to their chicks. Or they look for nuts, hard nuts, or bits of wood. And now that there's bits of plastic floating out there, they're going, wow, this looks pretty good. So they feed it to their chicks. It's not infanticide, it is nurturing. And you got David Attenborough weeping over it. I won't tell you about the walruses, but you maybe heard about it. But isn't that something, that they make it look like that's what the inside of a bird looks like? I took this photo on my beach up at Winter Harbor. This is a small plastic float with marine gooseneck barnacles growing on it. One of the main reasons that fish and birds eat pieces of plastic is to get the food growing on them. It is after many studies on the Greenpeace boats and in my ocean up north, but I've been in a lot, I believe that wood and plastic floating in the ocean, like what's the real difference? I mean, plastic is made from trees. It's made from oil and gas. It was once a plant. It's just a hydrocarbon. Plastic and wood make more food for marine life than any damage they cause, by far, because stuff grows on them. And then the marine life eats it. And sometimes even eats the plastic. But you know what? Evolution was really smart. It tends to make the in-hole smaller than the out-hole. Because the other way around, you couldn't get it back out again. Right? Very smart. It just kind of works that way. Number 5. Africa's oldest baobab trees are dying at an unprecedented rate, and climate change may be to blame. Again, the invisible carbon dioxide and the remote baobab trees in eastern Africa. So all these headlines come all at once, on the same day usually, from a media release that's come out from somewhere. The most amazing thing about this was that the only source of expertise on baobab trees associated with this story was a Romanian chemist who said such a disastrous decline is very unexpected. And what he reported, the only numbers in his report, was that 8 of the 13 oldest baobab trees have died in the past 10 years. That's less than 1 a year. There's a lot of baobab trees. A lot. And wouldn't you maybe expect the oldest trees to die? That's what they make the big deal about. Oh my God, the oldest trees are dying. Unlike with people, for example. Even Fox bought this one. I'm not kidding you. Number 6, the reason warming slowed down during the 2000s, which it did, it was coming up on a little bit of a curve in the 1990s, and then it sort of slowed down and almost stopped, is because the heat is going into the oceans, where it will eventually come out and destroy the climate. It's hiding there, lurking in the oceans. Instead of warming the atmosphere, it's been sucked up by the sea. Of course, that's invisible. Here's the amount of heat there is in the oceans compared to the atmosphere. So if the atmosphere went up by 1 degree Celsius, that would be a 0.001 Celsius change in the heat of the oceans. In other words, undetectable. So when they say the heat's going into the oceans, they're presenting you with something you cannot check by observation, because we don't have a thermometer or a system for the whole world's oceans to determine the average temperature has gone up by 0.001 degrees Celsius. So it's just another fairy tale. They make stuff up as they go along. As one of their hypotheses is refuted, they just make up another one. 7, nuclear energy is too dangerous and radiation will kill you. Radiation is invisible too. And everybody's afraid of it. Well, everybody in the Western world. Nuclear energy has killed less people than any other electricity generating technology per kilowatt produced, per unit of energy produced. Well, Chernobyl wasn't very pleasant. The Russians, during the Cold War, when the Iron Curtain was up and Western scientists didn't have any influence on what they were doing, just cookie-cuttered their plutonium production reactors for their nuclear weapons program and made power reactors out of them, even though they had a physical quality where it was stupid to make power reactors out of them. It's called positive void coefficient. All other reactor designs in the world have a negative void coefficient. Positive void coefficient means the reactor can actually go critical and have a nuclear reaction and explode. That would be what happens when that happens. No other nuclear reactors in the world are built like that. The accidents at 3 Mile Island and Fukushima were meltdowns, where the fuel melted because it wasn't being cooled after the reactor shut down. It's not a nuclear explosion. And no one was killed at either 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl. And no one will have any serious health effects from Fukushima. And they shouldn't have evacuated the people, because 1,600 people died in the evacuation, and no people died from the radiation. That's just a short story. It's a big story. Here's what's happening in the world with nuclear reactors. This is China, under construction, 25 reactors. Planned and proposed 200 new reactors. The United States has 99. It has the most of anybody in the world, but it hasn't built any new ones for a very long time. India and Russia. These are the 3 main nuclear energy countries, all 3 of which are now ahead of the United States in technology and development of different types of nuclear reactor designs, etc. The United States has fallen back into 4th place. That's what's going on. Number 8, genetically modified organisms will harm us and damage the environment. Has anyone ever seen what's in a GMO that is harmful? Have you observed the ghost in the machine yourself? The spirit behind the tree that's going to leap out and eat your children. Right? What is it in the GMO that people are afraid of? It's invisible, obviously, whatever it is, because you can't see it. There's actually nothing there that is harmful. And this has been decided by all the major health institutions in the world, science institutions in the world, agricultural organizations in the world, food organizations in the world. That list goes on to the other side of that room. There's nothing in GMOs that can harm you. Period. This is a map of vitamin A deficiency in the world. In the rice-eating countries in particular, which has no vitamin A, whereas corn, potatoes, and wheat have vitamin A in them, the staple food of a society. Also, rice is the staple food of the most poor people. It's pretty cheap. It's just starch, not much else. So the people in those countries are deficient among preschool children in vitamin A. 250 million preschool children are deficient in vitamin A, and 2 million of them die, mostly children and some mothers, from diseases related to vitamin A deficiency every year. Here's the organizations involved with the development of golden rice, which is a genetically modified rice that contains beta-carotene that provides us with vitamin A. You notice the Gates Foundation is in there, the only sensible billionaire in the world as far as I can see. Rockefeller, International Rice Research, the Helen Keller International, the people who are most concerned with blindness. Because about 500,000 children go blind before they die, the 2 million who die, they go blind first. Because vitamin A is necessary for your eyesight. But it's also necessary for your immune system, which wasn't figured out until the United Nations Children's Organization figured it out about 15 years ago. So that the reason why children were dying of malaria and dengue and diarrhea was not because of those diseases, which they would have recovered from if they'd had enough vitamin A, but because their immune system was compromised by a lack of vitamin A. This is a golden rice field trial at the Philippines Rice Research Institute. Pretty scary, eh? Here's a group of urban activists bussed in by Greenpeace to destroy the golden rice field trials at the government-sponsored International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines in August of 2013. Up until then, for many years, it was invented in '99, perfected in 2005. I'd been studying it for years and talking about it in all my lectures, and how Greenpeace was opposed to it, and the rest of the so-called movement were opposed to it being introduced, even though it was killing 2 million children a year not to have it. And Greenpeace put out a media release when they bust these people in to do this, that farmers had destroyed the golden rice field, instead of saying urban leftist activists have destroyed the rice field. So it gave the whole international communities learned that Philippine farmers were against GMO rice and went in there and destroyed it. So I sat down at my kitchen table in Winter Harbor with my brother, late brother Michael, who became the media guy on the campaign, and my wife Eileen, who became the representative of mothers on the campaign, and we put together a campaign with Germans and Italians and French and people in India and Bangladesh and Philippines, and we started the Golden Rice campaign. Up until then, no one was campaigning for golden rice. 800 GMO, anti-GMO groups were campaigning against GMOs and including golden rice. And golden rice was just being worked on by scientists and bureaucrats. No one was actually doing any media work in favor of it, like to support it. So we created the Golden Rice campaign. Here we are campaigning against Greenpeace at the dock in Vancouver. This is a long story. The website is allowgoldenricenow.org. It's got the whole history of this campaign, which went on for 3 years. We reached about 80 million people with a positive message of golden rice. And last year, Bangladesh approved the commercial growing of golden rice. And that will go forward now, so we can sort of rest on our laurels a little bit. That's how much golden rice, sorry about that, oh my God. Why won't it go backwards? There we go. That's how much golden rice it takes per day to prevent 2 million kids from dying every year. Golden rice can prevent the worst nutritional problem in the whole world today, and it's finally coming in, and it's taken 15 years. If golden rice was a cure for malaria or dengue or HIV/AIDS or the Ebola virus, it would have been improved in 6 months, just to make sure it didn't poison people to death. But it's not even a medicine. It is a food. with beta-carotene in it. It's not like a chemotherapy drug, which can kill you if you get too much of it. It's just a food, and it was stopped for 15 years while 30 million kids died by the movement that I used to be in, that I thankfully left before this kind of thing happened. I'm almost there. This is the most recent story. I was just in Washington, D.C. before the House Natural Resources Committee dealing with this United Nations report. They say it was leaked. It was leaked by the people who wrote it. The report actually hasn't been issued yet. They leaked the summary for policymakers and the media release about the summary for policymakers. So we don't even know what the full report says, but we think it probably says these same things. 1 million species are at risk of extinction right now. We only have 1.5 million species cataloged, identified, and named. They say, oh yes, but we've extrapolated that to 8.7 million. Extrapolated. That's actually a statistics word. And you can't take nothing and extrapolate millions of species from it. These new species that they've invented, that are undocumented, unnamed, unphotographed, and unverified altogether, are invisible. 1 million of them could go extinct tomorrow and we wouldn't know it had happened. Honestly, that's the truth, and that's what I told the Congressional Committee, and they got no argument about that because they don't even know what the hell they are. Here are some of the 1 million unidentified and unnamed endangered species here on this graph. You see them there? They're all in there. Okay, just quickly, the last 3. Pesticide residues in our food cause cancer, birth defects, autism, and brain damage. It's invisible, of course. You can't see the pesticide residues in your food. There's zero evidence of this. If this were true, they'd do something about it. If they knew that pesticide residues were killing people, they would make some rules up. There is no evidence whatsoever. Actually, the National Cancer Research Institutes of Canada and the US joined together in the late 90s for a 5-year joint study on this and concluded there is no evidence. Yet there is evidence that 30% of human cancers are caused by tobacco consumption, and another 35 are caused by bad diets, mainly too much cholesterol and fat, right? Not by pesticide residues in food, which are invisible, and they can make up a story. Foreign salmon are full of poisons, and they are destroying the wild salmon. They're underwater, where no one can see them, and they make up stories about sea lice, these awful sea lice that are going around down there, killing everything. It's complete fabrication. No truth to it. Farmed salmon are taking the pressure off the wild stocks. They are providing a healthy food, and they are taking 24/7 year-round employment in local communities on the coast where employment's tough to find. It's a sustainable development. And I hope you try the Costco steelhead, being grown in Lake Diefenbaker in Saskatchewan. It's fantastic. It is the best salmonid product that has been produced to date by aquaculturists. Ocean acidification will kill all the coral reefs and shellfish in the world. Again, an invisible catastrophe. Ocean acidification is a complete fabrication. There is no basis in science for it. It's garbage. Don't listen to it. It's not true. It can't happen. There's no physical or biological possibility of this occurring. You notice that CO2 was 6,000 ppm back when the proliferation of marine life called the Cambrian explosion occurred. Under those conditions, 6,000 ppm. It's 400 now. They're saying that's causing ocean acidification. It is a lie, an out-and-out lie. Pure fabrication. Okay, nearly there. This John Robson, he's kind of neat. I like him a lot. He says, how come Only nice species are going to go extinct. Pretty ones. Ones we love. Cuddly ones. Right? Like polar bears and penguins and coral reefs and reindeer and pandas and bumblebees and koalas, salmon, butterflies, narwhals. Whereas the other ones on the other side there, they're not going to go extinct from climate change. There's going to be a plague of them because of climate change. A plague of rats, venomous jellyfish, locusts, cockroaches, large spiders, fungus, and many slimy things. There's going to be a plague of them. So here's the slogan I invented for a conference in Calgary a few months ago, which I think is wonderful. That, you know, I'm not a partisan, and my father taught me not to go into politics because we had other things to do. And as a scientist, I think it's probably not a good idea to be on a political side, even though I'm kind of anyways. But I'm not a partisan. I support leadership. And we've got a man in this room here who exudes leadership. And that is the best thing about this whole movement. Leadership at the grassroots level, where I've been all my life swimming upstream. I think a salmon, when I was in my last incarnation, I must have been a salmon, because I've been swimming upstream all my life. But leadership requires swimming upstream against the tide, against the current, because that's what you have to do to make things change. Just what you have to do. So what I say, save Canada, quit Paris, and build pipelines. Pipelines there are in the United States of America, or I sometimes refer to it as the United States of America, just for fun. Because when the elephant rolls over, it's kind of hard on the mouse, isn't it? And they just rolled over on us big time with our oil sands project, because that's hundreds of millions of dollars are coming from the Rockefeller brothers and the Pew and the Lazar and the Bullitt and the Packard and all these other huge foundations in the States being funneled through Tides Foundation into Tides Canada and being distributed to people who have a bone to pick up here in the environmental movement and the First Nations, and they're all divided by it. They've divided and conquered the whole blasted place over this, as if there's something wrong with our oil. Meanwhile, the United States has increased its oil production to where in 4 years it's going to be equivalent to Saudi Arabia and Russia put together, and they're exporting oil all over the world at world prices, while we have to accept a 15 to 30% discount because they're our only customer, and they're not a very good customer anymore because they already got more oil than they know what to do with. So get the oil to Tidewater and to the east and the west. What kind of country is it where the two biggest provinces in the nation would rather bring in oil in tankers from Nigeria and Saudi Arabia and Venezuela than they would take oil from their own country? What kind of country is that? What kind of country? What kind of country would put more importance on 9,000 SNC Lavalin jobs than the 100,000 people and their kids out of work in Alberta? What kind of country? It makes me embarrassed to be a British Columbian, the fact that our government here is trying to stop that pipeline from coming where it can get oil out of here. If they're worried about the orcas or the salmon or whatever, then make even more rules for the carriers. Whatever they have to do, they're already double-hulled and required to go 5 miles an hour and have 2 tugs, one tethered and one untethered and all the rest of it. And there's not been an oil spill with the tankers going out of Vancouver for the last 25 years. There's never been a major oil spill out of Vancouver. So, get on with it. Thank you.